ciowatercongress.org. And you can learn more about the Colorado Foundation for Water Education at www.yourwatercolorado.org. So before we get started, we have just a couple of housekeeping notes. And first off, we wanted to thank you and also all of our presenters. These presentations, our webinars, our workshops, they're made possible by your support, so thank you very much. Secondly, just a brief overview of today's webinar. So it's titled Technical, Political, and Environmental Requirements of Transbasin Diversions. And we're going to begin with a presentation from Brian Warner from Northern Water. And he is going to provide background on the historical development of transbasin diversions. Our second speaker is Becky Mitchell from the Colorado Water Conservation Board. She's going to discuss the primary regulations associated with transbasin diversions and how they've changed through time, specifically the state's role in that. And our third speaker is Casey Funk from Denver Water, and he will end with a presentation regarding how we currently interact with the requirements of transbasin diversions. As attendees, you guys are all going to be muted throughout all of the presentations, but we would love to see and hear your questions. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the questions pane in your GoToWebinar toolbar, which is on the side of your screen. So if you have any trouble finding that, you can go ahead and send an email to Eric Dorn, edorn@cowatercongress.org. Our presenters will do their best to address any of your questions regarding content throughout the presentation, but we'll also have 10 minutes at the end of the webinar to address any unanswered questions, which Caitlin and I will go ahead and read aloud for the presenters to respond to at the very end of the webinar. So again, if you have any technical questions, please direct those to Eric Dorn, who is our tech guru, edorn@cowatercongress.org. To give you a starting point before we begin our discussion, we wanted to talk about transbasin diversions. They've had a long, changing, and important history redistributing water across Colorado. And for our purposes, we're defining transbasin diversions as those water projects that move water across the continental divide from one of Colorado's 4 major river basins to another. So we're talking about projects that move water between the Platte, Arkansas, Rio Grande, and Colorado River basins, and ultimately change the course of that water. In Colorado, there are 27 of these that move more than 580,000 acre-feet of water each year. So without further ado, Brian Werner with Northern Water will start us off. We hope you enjoy today's webinar.
Thank you, Caitlin, and welcome everyone. I want to give a plug real quick for the Colorado Foundation for Water Education Transbasin, their new Citizens Guide. I think it does a nice overview, and some of what I'm going to be talking about is taken from that today. But if you haven't seen it or are familiar with it, I recommend highly that you get it. The other thing is I'm going to make a bibliography available of materials that I generally use with the hopes that all of you on this will help add to that bibliography. So once in the next couple of months we have a sort of a very well done total bibliography throughout the state. I'm a little top heavy in the areas that I'm at in northern Colorado. So with that, let me get started. I want to talk briefly, ask about how early transbasin diversions were developed and built. Many of us are familiar with the legal basis, 1882 Coffin versus Left Hand, which establishes the legal basis for that. Although it's important to understand that there were actually some transbasin diversions that predate the Coffin v. Left Hand decision. East and West Hoosier ditches in 1860 near Fairplay, which were mining purposes, and then the one that's the oldest continuously used transbasin diversion, the Ewing Ditch in 1880, took water from the Eagle River into Tennessee Creek. So those predated 1882 and Coffin versus Left Hand. A few things about early diversions I think are important to understand how they were built and developed. Most of the early ones were built by farmer cooperatives, ditch companies, irrigation companies, who needed more water getting into dry times. They were reaching points in rivers where they were becoming over-appropriated, especially in dry years. So they started looking elsewhere for additional water supply. Many of these used shareholder money. Sometimes it was investment money from across the seas. There were some English insurance companies that got involved with some of the ditch companies in the Poudre Basin. And then they were able to get to some of the more elaborate undertakings like Transbasin Diversion. This was supplemental water to each of the basins. Many times these ditch companies were led by the community leaders. The top people in communities were parts of these ditch companies who saw the value of bringing water in. In the Fort Collins area, it was the newspaper publisher. It was the ditch company president. It was the president of the chamber. One of the most prominent dairymen in the region. All helped develop some of these early diversions. The other thing, the earliest of these diversions were all very small in scale, 1, 2, maybe 3 miles, but that was about it in the early 1880s, 1890s diversions. And they also helped push the need for additional storage facilities in the basin. I'll mention that when I get to the Grand River Ditch. Grand River Ditch was lengthened throughout its history, but it couldn't be to its full length until Long Draw Reservoir was built to capture and store that extra water. I'm going to talk briefly about the Poudre Basin in terms of how it, I think, is a good example of how these transbasin diversions were built. By 1882, there were 53 different canals and ditches operating within the Poudre Basin in the Plains area. 1882 is the first transbasin diversions into the upper headwaters of the Poudre. Lost Lakes and Cameron Pass diversions were built in 1882. But I think the best example of talking about this is the Skyline Ditch, which was first surveyed in 1891 and began work later in 1891 as one of the best examples of how these early transbasin diversions were built and developed, especially because this was so successful. The Skyline Ditch was owned and operated by a water supply and storage company, an organization that still exists in the Fort Collins area and supplies water to the farming community. They had built it, started in 1892, tried to finish in 1893. Weather intervened. As you might imagine, when you're 9,000 or 10,000 feet in elevation, you're running into some difficulties, especially when you get into the winter months and trying to build that. So they had to shut it down. Came back in 1893. At one point, they had 300 men working up on this ditch on the headwaters of the Poudre Canyon. But it's not until 1894, in fact, on July 4th, 1894, the first water was diverted through this Skyline Ditch. A little bit about the process for building these ditches, because it was definitely a difficult piece of engineering. Built on the side of a mountain. Excuse me. I was going to move this. For all of you watching, that's just the Trans Mountain diversions, and then this is a map that talks specifically about the diversions into the headwaters of the Poudre. So you'll see the Skyline Ditch there on the left, just above Chambers Lake, if you're looking at that right now. This was 45-degree slope. The ditch starting point is 1,500 feet above the base of the mountain. The original part of this ditch, they gave it a slope to make it self-cleaning. It washed out the banks, so they had to begin again. The second attempt is the Skyline Ditch, that's still in use today. They blasted a 110-foot-long tunnel. They used dynamite, mule power, elbow grease, no power equipment to build these early ditches either. And if you think about it, you're up at the headwaters of the Poudre Canyon, which is a couple days ride to bring equipment and haul equipment up to. So it wasn't easy just to get the men and equipment there. But as I said, that part was completed in 1894, and they had water coming through to help the farmers in the Fort Collins area. Grand River Ditch is probably the most well-known of the early diversions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it except to point out that the Water Supply and Storage Company is the organization that actually develops the Grand River Ditch. They still own and operate it today. And they were busy building the Skyline Ditch in 1892, 3, and 4, so it's not until late in 1894 that they turned their attention to the Grand River Ditch. Grand River Ditch, most well-known of all the early diversions, and the first to take water from the Colorado River basin, or the Grand River at that time, into eastern Colorado. One other thing about Transbasin Diversions, they added significantly to the price of shares, the value of shares of those ditch companies that built them. As an example, Water Supply and Storage Company in the 1890s, a share was about $400. By 1910, when they built a couple of these Transbasin Diversions added to their water supply, they were up to $3,600. And to continue that, in the 40s, they got to $7,000, and today I believe they're in the $25,000, $30,000 range, if not more. So Transbasin Diversions were an economic boon for these shareholders in the ditch companies as well. The larger Transbasin Diversions then into the 20th century involved generally larger efforts, and primarily when the state and the federal government get involved. Real quick, if you're looking at this, this is the early work on that Grand River Ditch. You'll see the hand labor there, and just what the Grand River Ditch looks like today. If you've ever been up in Rocky Mountain National Park, that's what it looks like if you're on their maintenance road. Then turning our attention in the 20th century to the larger efforts. Reclamation gets established in 1902, and then they start jump-starting water projects in the American West. In Colorado, in terms of Transbasin Diversions, they get involved with the Colorado Big Thompson project in the 1930s, and they help build what still today is the largest single Trans Mountain Diversion project in the state. Delivers about 220,000 acre-feet from the west slope to the east slope annually. That involved building a tunnel underneath Rocky Mountain National Park, the Adams Tunnel, which is 13 miles long, 9 feet 9 inches in diameter. And this happens to be a picture of the tunnel being built. Started in 1940. It took 4 years to hole through, and then another 3 years to concrete line. At the time, it was the longest tunnel ever built in the world from 2 separate headings. They met somewhere near the middle in June of 1944, and then on June 23rd, 1947, you'll see the people surrounding the little East Portal Reservoir where the first water comes through that tunnel. Oops. Anyway, the first tunnel in June of 43. The Fire Arc project in the 1950s, another Federal Bureau of Reclamation project. And then Denver with their Transbasin Diversion, the Moffett system in the 30s. Dillon and the Roberts Tunnel in the 1960s. Today, just to bring it up to current, many of those early diversions, I mentioned Skyline Ditch, Michigan Ditch, Ewing Ditch, which was the early one into the Arkansas area. Many of those are owned by cities today who own and operate those early diversions. The Ewing Ditch is operated by the Pueblo Board of Waterworks today. As they want to diversify their water portfolios and get some of those earliest water rights, they have acquired many of those early ditch systems. It provides additional water for agriculture. Obviously, that's what it did in the early days in the 1880s. It's helped with some municipal supplies today. And one of the key, I think, aspects of the Transbasin water is that it's fully consumable. The Citizen's Guide talks about this a little bit. It can be recycled, it can be reused, it can be used to extinction, which brings a lot more value to it. I will point out, unless it's Colorado Big Thompson Project water, we have an agreement where CBP water, even though it's Transbasin, is first use only. Transbasin water brought a lot of economic value to the transferring basin. It increased the flows in the rivers there. And with the Conservancy Act, especially for water conservancy districts, it has provided compensatory storage to the basin of origin. And then with the impacts fairly obvious to the basin of origin with some less water without compensation from the Act, there's some environmental impacts and some fish habitat impacts. And I'm sure in the coming portions of this series we'll get into those issues a little bit more. I do want to point out before I finish here that the bibliography will be available on the Water Congress website, and I hope those of you that are interested in the history of transbasin diversions will help me as we broaden that bibliography to include any number of other writings about transbasin diversions. And please feel free to send me, my email will be there, send me your suggestions and we'll add them to the list, and in the next month or two we'll have a more diversified bibliography for transbasin diversions. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Becky.
All right. Is my slideshow showing?
Just one moment, Becky.
Okay. Perfect. So I get the part of where the state comes in and where the state fits in all of this. And we have some history in the state of involvement, of course, and then there's some ongoing discussions that I think affect us all. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. And I've kind of, this is just a hypothetical. This isn't proposed big projects or anything like that, but it kind of shows that the thoughts are out there and there's some ideas that are out there, and what do we do? So I've kind of divided up where the state's involvement is based on state agencies. So the first one would be Colorado Parks and Wildlife, and they're involved in federal projects or EISs, water projects, not just Trans Mountain Diversions, through the Colorado Revised Statute 3760-122-2. That's the Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Statute. I don't know if any of you all recall Two Forks and what came out of that in the kind of in the midnight hour. Some would say that the project was pulled, and there was some comment that the issues were that the state didn't support the project. And so out of that came this Fish and Wildlife Mitigation Statute that required Parks and, well, at that time it was Division of Wildlife, but now it's Parks and Wildlife, to look at the impacts of a EIS as they relate to a fish and wildlife resource. And only those impacts. It's important to recognize that the impacts that they were to look at were only those that are stated in the EIS. You couldn't go beyond the bounds of the EIS. And propose mitigation or work with the project proponent to develop a mitigation plan to deal with those impacts. And then that would then go to, I have a timeline, to the Parks and Wildlife Commission, and then on to the CWCB, and then would become the position of the state in regards to that project only specifically to Fish and Wildlife Resources. So if both the Parks and Wildlife Commission and the CWCB approve the mitigation plan, it becomes the state's position on mitigation for that project. So there's a little timeline in front of you. It makes it look very simple. I thought it was important to recognize it's really not that simple. I've been through a few of these at this point, and no timeline like this. This is the best laid plans, as you can see. And on the left of this slide is kind of the big key points within the process. And all of these drag out, as anybody who's involved knows. Some of the competing interests that Fish and Wildlife is, or Parks and Wildlife is looking at is the open space, the rafting, kayaking flows, that all of those recreational things, along with the terrestrial wildlife habitat and the aquatic habitat. There's native species issues, so if there's an area where native species are of concern, that's weighed pretty heavily. They're always looking at the winter flows for fish and then any other additional wildlife habitat. So the riparian area is really important. So it's been, there's a few of these processes that have happened, and it's been a pretty difficult because, as you can see in these competing interests, that's not the full list. Parks and Wildlife is really trying to factor in and make everyone really happy. And then comes in the Department of Public Health and Environment and through the Water Quality Control Division, and they're responsible for the 401 certification. So Section 401 of the Federal Clean Water Act requests that an applicant applying for a federal license or permit provide certification from the state that any discharges will comply with the Act. So this would include any state water quality requirements. So that reasonable assurance piece is just being able to show that water quality standards will be attained and with the project or with the project in it and additional mitigation. So the mitigation can satisfy this requirement. Some of the certification requirements of the agency, which is in our case, CDPHE, Water Quality Control Division, is that per Regulation 82, a permitting anti-degradation determination and draft certification are required at this public notice. And then so the Water Quality Control Division has a year to issue certification. And I know folks say, okay, it's a year, we can do that. A year comes up pretty quickly. And so it's a difficult task to do from that perspective. So some of the Regulation 82 consists of an initial project review. That's the who's the applicant, where is the project, does the project impact reviewable or use protected waters, what's the stated project description, and have the flow impacts been defined. Then that draft certification will indicate whether or not the certification will include conditions or not. So we can do things with conditions here. And then in terms of there's that 30-day comment period. That's just for typical projects. There's some non-typical projects, I guess you could say. And hold on. Then comes along the final project review, where the Water Quality Control Division reviews the water quality impacts in the EIS and any other water quality reports that are out there. So unlike the Colorado Parks and Wildlife process, they're able to look at additional reports, which I think is really important. And this considers all potential water quality impacts, both direct and indirect, for the proposed project. And then there's a project review against the water quality standards, so the basic standards of the state, or the water quality standards of the state, and those are basic standards, numeric surface water segment standards, anti-degradation standards, along with that 303G listed segment, so that we look at that. And then there's the final certification, and that, again, may include conditions. So on to the Colorado Water Conservation Board and the Interbasin Compact Committee. So those two processes that I just talked about are kind of what's out there and what's in regulation or in statute and what we're required to do. And then comes some of what's being discussed on a broader statewide level with the think tank per se. And I'm not sure if many of you have heard about the conceptual agreement that came out of the Interbasin Compact Committee. I think Casey will get into a little bit from the Front Range perspective, but the Interbasin Compact Committee has done a significant level of work, really building on the work that's happened over the last decade to come up with what they were originally charged to do, which is just a conceptual agreement of basically where the conversation should start if it related to a Trans Mountain diversion. So this, I had to put this in here because I had to do a little bit of a plug for Colorado's water plan, and but I wanted to focus on this circle right here because a big piece of what the IBCC has done goes into Chapter 8 of Colorado's water plan, which is completely dedicated to the work of the IBCC, and it's not a prescriptive agreement, but really a conceptual think about this kind of agreement. So it's important to recognize what was done in this work. So like I said, this isn't prescriptive. If a Trans Mountain diversion was proposed, how would the discussion take place? So this is how the IBCC feels this discussion should take place. We feel like it's a breakthrough that we really, as staff, push the IBCC to have these tough conversations, and say, let's talk about our future together as the people of the state, rather than having the feds come in and tell us how it's going to be done in a case of emergency. So can we be more prepared? So it's the starting point for the risk management and protecting the existing users using the West Slope water out there. So it's also an integrated suite of action. So it's not just one thing that says we have to do this much conservation before we can talk about Trans Mountain diversion. It's trying to work in concert with everything that is out there, the options that are out there, what's happening, and going from that. So it's pulling everything, trying to pull everything together and say, let's talk about it all at once. A big piece of it was protecting existing uses. I mean, we all know that's extremely important, and we have to protect the existing users that are already out there that have relied on a certain river source or water source. And then it is just the starting point. I wanted to talk a little bit in the next slide about what it's not. Unlike the other things, like I said, that are regulatory or statutory requirements, the conceptual agreement is not legally binding. It is purely, again, conceptual and really built on the long-term discussions that have been had by water leaders across the state. So, so it also doesn't advocate or identify a specific Trans Mountain diversion project. It's also not finalized. It's a living document. Just like a lot of the work that we're doing, we're building on it. We're recognizing when we've missed something. So we're really saying this is capable of change at any time, and we can modify it as we go through time and need. And then also doesn't cover every issue that's out there. I don't think any document out there does that. So we recognize that we need more work on conservation. We push pretty hard there, but sometimes we can't get to the end point. It also really needs to, we need to spend some more time on the basin of origin issues. There was a lot of comment on hydraulic modeling and the triggers, and that goes into risk. And then also the hydraulic variability, so the wet and dry years, and so how we operate in different years. It doesn't circumvent any other agreement. It doesn't supersede or trump them. It again is just that conceptual agreement. It's also not prioritized. They're just lists. It doesn't mean one thing is important or one piece of the agreement is more important than the other. And I think that's all I have. And so I think we'll move on to Casey.
Hi everybody, this is Casey. It's a little bit weird not being able to see the participants that I'm talking to, nor really fully knowing who's in the audience. So, and I haven't seen questions come up, but I understand I'll be able to see some, so please share questions either during or after my presentation. In front of you, well, let me go to my outline. One of the things that I was asked to talk about is what is the flexibility and use of Trans Mountain water? Well, primarily the flexibility aspect of it is Trans Mountain Diversions provide an additional supplemental physical supply of water to meet the demands in Denver service area. And Denver service area is basically the city and counties of Denver, the boundaries and the residents within those boundaries. And then we also serve many entities that surround Denver by contracts, either treated water contracts or raw water contracts. The slide that you see in front of you is a depiction of our collection system. Yellow is our South Platte system, which is what Denver started off in supplying the demands of the citizens and the customers of Denver. In 1936, if you look up at the green, the Moffett Tunnel collection system, Denver first started diverting water from its Fraser River and Williams Fork collection systems either into Clear Creek or South Boulder Creek. In the 50s, Denver built a tunnel called the Vasquez Tunnel that took water from the Williams Fork side and rediverted it basically from the Clear Creek side and put it into the Fraser system where it could be then delivered to the Moffett Tunnel and then delivered down South Boulder Creek to an intake through what's called the South Boulder Conduit to the Moffett treatment plant where it was treated and provided water to Denver. Keep in mind that was the 30s. That was a pretty severe drought during that time frame. The South Platte sources were not able to keep up with the demands of Denver's customers, which is why Denver started off with a surveying effort in 1921 to put this collection system together. The Moffett Tunnel, as you may know, is a railroad tunnel, but to construct that railroad tunnel, the engineers had to put through what they call a pioneer bore to make sure that everything lined up correctly before they started building the railroad tunnel. And it was that pioneer bore that Denver started and envisioned as using as the first trans-mountain diversion in its system to divert the Fraser and Williams Fork waters. To the north end of that green area is an area that was originally developed by the city of Englewood and Climax Molybdenum, and we entered into an agreement with those two entities that we would divert water or operate that system, which is called the Cabin Meadow Creek system, also in Grand County. It diverts around 4,000 to 5,000 acre-feet a year, and we take that through the Moffett Tunnel, treat it, serve it to our customers, and in return we trade a equivalent amount of water, basically, generally, on the south end to city of Englewood, and we also supply or provide water to Climax on the Williams Fork side of the ledger. As you see in the pink, that's the Williams Fork collection system, and I talked about that a little bit earlier. And at the bottom end is the Williams Fork Reservoir. It provides replacement water so that the Williams Fork Fraser system, as well as Dillon Reservoir, can continue diverting when generally a senior call is on, and that is usually the Shoshone Power Plant. Then to the south is the Blue River system that was started in 1946, completed in 1963. Again, more physical supply. A lot of this came about during the drought of the 50s, and it is also considered a supplemental supply for Denver to meet its contractual and in-city uses. What's important about the Blue River Diversion project is what came out of that was contested, and that's the Blue River Decree that people may be familiar with. It was a stipulation that Denver entered into with entities from the West Slope, United States, who owned and operated Green Mountain Reservoir to the north on the Blue River. And what came out of the Blue River Decree was a stipulation where Denver promised that it would only use water diverted from the Blue River for municipal purposes. It would only use it within the metropolitan area, and that it would reuse the water, divert it under a first use, and in those return flows, we would reuse those return flows subject to legal and economic limitations. And that's basically the document that controls our operations today. Let's see what the next slide is. This is sort of a scoping view of the Grand County collection systems, the Adams Tunnel that Brian earlier talked about, and then the Fraser Moffett Tunnel system, the Williams Fork system. As you can see in the south, it's a fairly small upper collection system, and then Williams Fork River to the north, and then in Summit County you can see where Green Mountain Reservoir is. Another reservoir that Denver shares with the river district is Wolford Mountain Reservoir, and we use a portion of that water for what we call substitution purposes, which is a concept that's in the Blue River Decree. Let's see, legal characteristics. Why is foreign water important to Denver from a legal matter? Well, on the east slope, it is not subject to the priority system, which means that we don't have to follow generally the rules of prior appropriation once that water is imported and used on the east slope. Since it is foreign water, it's reusable in its characteristics. which allows us to make exchanges upon it. That's the water that we can use in our recycling plant, and I'm trying to think of how else we can reuse it, but those two matter areas in particular. The other thing that's important about foreign water is that we can move it usually around in the basin of receipt without any further decrees. We just basically have to track that water so that the state officials know what type of water is in storage at any particular time in our system. But we're not limited by a decree on where we put that water. The next question I was asked, and Fiona, if I'm running out of time, please tell me because I can't see a clock from my screen. Headwater impacts. No, the question is, what political and technical impacts originally made by Trans Mountain diversions are we still addressing? Headwater impacts. If we look at this map on Grand County, you can see our diversion structures on the headwaters do divert the waters from those stream systems, and they do cause impacts. They cause impacts to the municipal users, the ski areas that are also growing, just like Denver is, and we're crimping their ability to meet their demands. It also has an impact on the environment, obviously. The water that we take out of these tributaries reduces the water below them. It affects the stream channels, and that's another impact on the headwater counties. I'm also going to throw out compact concerns. To the extent that we take water out away from the west slope, it affects the Colorado River compact. And should a compact call come on, it will not be distinguished. Well, it could be distinguished, but let's say through our diversions, it triggers a compact call. All users on the west slope with priorities junior to 1922 or 1929, depending upon who you talk to, could be impacted or could be curtailed, that could be triggered by some of these trans-mountain diversions. And these are type of issues that everybody's looking at right now. The next thing on my outline is, are we proposing additional transbasin diversions for the future? And my answer to that is yes. We are currently trying to permit and construct an enlargement of Gross Reservoir. It is not on the map that you're looking at, but further to the east from the Moffett Tunnel on South Boulder Creek, we have a reservoir, Gross Reservoir, that is currently constructed to a capacity around 40,000, and we are trying to enlarge that reservoir to its decreed capacity of 113,000 acre feet, although I think it's actually going to be constructed a little bit bigger than that for additional South Boulder Creek waters that will be stored by Boulder and the city of Lafayette. But from the west slope, it's envisioned to be 113,000 acre feet. And then there's the Windy Gap Firming project that is also being permitted. So those two projects are currently underway. And then what we have looked at, well, no, as we were going through this permitting process, we started negotiating with West Slope entities regarding some of the impacts that would be caused by these projects, and we were trying to clear up old issues that had been simmering involving the Blue River Decree, etc. And out of that came what we call the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement. It was a principle. The principles came together back in September of 2010. Then from that point on, we went to there were certain conditions that we had to follow through on before certain parties would stipulate or approve on this cooperative agreement. And it finally came all together in September 2013 where everybody signed off on it. Well, part of the cooperative agreement is we are attempting to put more water back in the Fraser system and Williams Fork system when Grand County and other water users want that water. 1,000 acre-feet is for the environmental flow, 375 for municipal uses and snowmaking uses. That we'll be able to do that once we put the Gross Reservoir into operation, the enlargement. Part of the conditions and hurdles associated with the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement is we have an abstention provision that any customers or new customers that we serve water to has to agree that they won't develop water on the Colorado River generally. And so if they want to lease some of our water, they need to make a hard decision on where their future supplies need to come. The other part of the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement was any new Trans Mountain diversions, the West Slope need to have joint benefits out of this. What is contemplated in the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement is a future 20,000 acre-foot yield project, but that can only be developed with the approval of the signatories to the Colorado River Cooperative Agreement, and they will need to see joint benefits before any future Trans Mountain Diversion project is envisioned. So, let me go back to 1937. 1937 is when the River District was organized. I believe 1937 when the Colorado Water Conservation Board was organized. 1937 is also when we got our decree, we, Denver Water, got our decree for the Fraser-Williams Fork system for a Trans Mountain diversion. And that's also when the Colorado Big Thompson project was being developed and considered at that time. So, one of the things is that the River District was created back in 1937 when all these activities were going on, and their charge was basically to conserve water on the Colorado River. And so basically anything that Denver does or any water user does has to go through the River District for their inspection of any kind of future Trans Mountain diversions. This is a slide of the Dillon, but I've already talked about it. Denver in 1860, you can see where the South Platte was more than enough to supply its needs. And here we are today. And as you can tell, Denver's growing, and we foresee Denver continuing to develop and grow, which is why we're keeping an eye on our increases in our Trans Mountain diversions through our existing systems and possibly new systems. But I want to also share with you, which I didn't put a slide on together, is that Denver's board is backing off on its development plans. In 2007, we got whipped in a lawsuit involving the Eagle, Colorado system, and the board decided that it no longer needed or wanted to develop the Eagle River unit in the Eagle County. It put a lot more conditions on any type of development of the proposed Eagle, Colorado reservoir. It would no longer have a, quote, Trans Mountain diversion aspect of it. It would be dedicated for joint use purposes on both the east and west slope, and it would be primarily used for substitution. So that happened in 2007. And so Denver is narrowing its view on what its future goals are as far as Trans Mountain diversions. But the slide you have now is the IBC summary points that Becky mentioned earlier. These are the points in this conceptual agreement. I'll go through it quickly. Let me look at the time real quick. Am I running out of time? Well, I am. I have about a minute according to my clock. So I think what's important is that is the number one. If the East Slope does do a Trans Mountain Diversion project, it accepts the risk for that project. Meaning it will accept the risk of any kind of compact curtailment call. We'll also need to work with the West Slope to manage a trigger on when that new Trans Mountain Diversion project can divert. Point two, it's not envisioned to build a project on the West Slope without what I call compensatory storage or some sort of joint benefit of the West for the West Slope. Point four, we contemplate, the Front Range communities want some type of insurance policy that for our existing Trans Mountain diversions, and frankly, I'm not really quite sure what that insurance policy would entail, but that needs to be worked out. Point five, we recognize that future West Slope needs to be accommodated. Colorado, I think that was intentional, that the whole state needs to commit to improve conservation and reuse, not only the Front Range. And we are, in point 7, pointing out that environmental and recreational needs need to be addressed with any new Trans Mountain Diversion project. I think I'm done. So, questions?
Are we unmuted? Okay. All right. So the first question that we have in our question panel goes back to, I believe it was asked during Becky's presentation. What about County 1041 regulatory permitting that might include additional mitigation or outright denial? So any of the presenters, feel free to answer.
Well, this is Brian with Northern Water. That's exactly what happened with the Windy Gap Firming project in Grand County with their 1041 process, where it did include additional mitigation and enhancements in order to avoid the outright denial that is asked in that question. So that's part of the process, and I think any agency or water organization that's dealing with that, that's reality in this day and age.
And the state plays, we try to be involved in that process and at least be aware of what's going on and be prepared to talk about the processes that included regulatory or statutory authority, and at least work with the project applicant and the county to so that the county has all the knowledge of what we've done as the state.
Casey, did you want to add anything to that?
Denver recognizes that counties have 1041 authority.
Okay, great. So the second question here, do the use limits apply to other entities that divert under that decree? And that was asked during your presentation, Casey.
I guess I don't understand the question. Do the use? Oh, you mean the municipal use? I'll try to guess on this. The municipal use under the Blue River Decree, yeah, to the extent it's provided to another entity, they have to use it for municipal purposes within the metropolitan area, if that's responsive to the question.
I think it was. That question was from Doug Hollister. And Doug, if you want to clarify that anymore, please feel free to type it in. Also asked during your presentation, Casey, was what about Straight Creek water? Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, Straight Creek is a actually flows in above Green Mountain right at Silverthorne, but right below Dillon Reservoir. We have the potential, in fact, we even have an intake structure built, but no pipeline that could easily divert that water over to Dillon Reservoir. As part of the CRCA, I think that is a project that would fall possibly within that 20,000 acre foot joint project. I'd have to think that through a little bit. But the issue with Straight Creek, it takes water away from Green Mountain Reservoir, and would we just have to pay it back? So at some point, to really fulfill the yield of Straight Creek, we would have to build additional storage for substitution, and probably additional storage to meet whatever the West Slope requests. So I think I answered that question, but if it's not responsive, just let me know.
All right, so the next question is, does it make sense to claim that because of transbasin diversions from the Colorado River Basin to the Front Range, that the basins that receive transbasin water are part of the Colorado River system, or could be considered so? To clarify, a compact call on the Colorado could curtail transbasin diversion? Question mark.
Is that to me, or is that to somebody else? This is
It's
Casey.
to any of you, I
You
believe.
can start, Casey.
No, I'm gonna pass on that one. Brian, why don't you take a shot at that?
Well, I think we get this occasionally. I say this it's definitely something Becky may want to pipe in. It's definitely something that it's in the discussion stages as we start looking at downstream POW and need on the Colorado, and if we get curtailed, who gets hit first, and what kind of priority numbers are we going to. So I'm confident that we've got the right people talking about that right now. I'm not sure that we have any decision yet, but it's definitely on the radar screen of those in the know in Colorado that are dealing with the transbasin diversions.
Becky, did you want to add anything to that?
I agree with what Brian said. The right people are talking about it.
Okay. So our next question is, how many transbasin diversions are currently being contemplated throughout Colorado, and how do the various water authorities empowered with transbasin diversion initiatives balance the potential for conservation versus new transbasin diversion? And that's for anybody who wants to answer it.
I'll go real quick, and then Casey can. This is Brian. Obviously, he mentioned the Moffett, the gross enlargement. Northern Water is looking, our municipal subdistrict is looking at Windy Gap Firming Project, which is some additional water from the Colorado River Basin. Those are the big trans-basin, trans-mountain diversion projects on the board right now. The conservation piece is absolutely essential. I make the statement that you're crazy and you're not going to get anywhere if you don't put conservation at or near the top of any conversation you have about additional and new water supplies. It's got to be a piece of that.
Casey or Becky, do you want to add to that?
Casey might be better in relation to
Yeah, well,
it.
yeah, the projects that we envision in the future are currently the gross enlargement and this 20,000 acre foot average yield project, which is really undefined at this point on how it will be developed or what kind of project it will be or when it will be. It may be a new filing. It may be the Straight Creek project. It may be something along those lines. Our board is committed to fully reusing its water to the extent it can, and it is ramped up. It's spending lots of money on our conservation efforts, and I believe that they have seen a substantial reduction in use by our customers over the last 10 years. Now, again, that takes a little bit of gleaning because, for instance, last summer our demands were way down, but it also rained a lot. And so you need to sort of factor that in about how much was really conservation and how much was really due to the weather. So yes, we are committed to conservation and reuse.
Okay, so the next question is for Becky specifically. If the IBCC conceptual agreement is not legally enforceable, why is it called an agreement?
Because it's called a conceptual agreement, and it's an agreement between the, it's an agreement amongst the IBCC members about where the discussion will start.
Okay, and we do have a couple more questions. I do realize that it's 1 minute past 10, so whoever needs to leave, please feel free to do so. Just really quickly to interrupt, if you wouldn't mind, if you do need to leave, please take a couple moments and fill out the survey so that we can get some feedback on this webinar. I just sent you all the links through your chat window, and we will send it out in an email in about an hour as well. So if you need to leave, please do so. Thank you very much for joining us today. But then moving on to the next question, why do the 7 IBCC points belong in the Colorado Water Plan when they weren't included in the governor's executive order? Becky, do you want to answer that?
Sure. Part of that came, they weren't explicitly asked for in the executive order. However, the governor didn't know that we were, that was being worked on at that point, or that we were going to get to that point. So we hadn't gotten to the conceptual agreement level that we're at now when the executive order came out, first of all. And as work progressed with it, we realized this is something that at least needs to be addressed or acknowledged within Colorado's water plan. And so it's its own separate chapter, and again, it's not a prescriptive chapter, but it describes that it's out there, these discussions are happening, it's a starting point.
All right, so the next question, are most diversions tunnels, or are many open ditches, that might accrue transit losses?
This is Brian. I think from a historical perspective, those early ones that I talked about, most of those are open channels. Most everything that's been built in the 20th century were tunnels. They were much larger. The Moffett Tunnel, the Roberts Tunnel, the Adams Tunnel, the tunnel for the Fry Arc project were all tunnels. So the bigger, larger ones, definitely. The smaller, earlier ones are open, and they did consider some transit losses, I believe, when they were building them.
This is Casey. Some of the canals, I believe, are still open on the Williams Fork and Fraser, but we are undertaking a program to put those open channels in conduit. Our diversions are measured at the east portal of the Moffett Tunnel. So to the extent that there is any losses, they accrue to the west slope. So if that begs more questions, keep going.
So Doug Hollister, I apologize for the delay in this, but Casey, Doug did follow up with clarification from his earlier question. He said the use limitation on Blue River water does not only apply to Denver water. Colorado Springs' use of Blue river water diverted through their Hoosier Pass system is also limited.
Yeah, that's a fair correction. I'm wearing my Denver water hat, not my Colorado Springs hat. But yeah, the stipulation involved both Denver and Colorado Springs.
Okay. So our next question is a little long. A consideration that has begun to arise in many discussions on the West Slope is the idea that new Trans-Mountain Diversion water should come with land use restrictions in how that water is used in new development. An example, Trans-Mountain Diversion water should only be feeding people's taps, not subdivision lawns. This idea has already met with somewhat outspoken opposition in public meetings in Glenwood from Front Range water leaders like Mark Piper and Joe Stibrich. Is Denver or Northern forming a position yet on land use restrictions for Trans-Mountain Diversion water in new development?
This is Casey. I believe our board has left that to the city land use people to make those determinations, and then we provide water to meet whatever the city land use requirements are. But I'm going out on a limb on that, and so it's just a belief on my part, and I'd have to check into that.
I would tend to agree, Casey. I mean, unfortunately, we don't have any land use authority as Northern Water. We supply raw water. We're part of the discussion, and we certainly will and can be in the future in terms of those things. But in terms of our authority, we have none in that regard.
All right, so that was the end of the questions that we have here. If you have any other questions, we can send them out to our speakers. We are going to make a recorded version of this webinar available to all registered attendees, whether they were able to attend today or not. But if you registered, you will get a recorded version of the webinar. And we will email that out within the next day or two.
Becky, no, Fiona, this is Casey.
Yes, go ahead, Casey.
Do we get royalties?
We can talk about that later.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And for everybody who's still on the line, if you haven't registered already, on December 10th, we have scheduled our second webinar in this series, and that will profile a Colorado Transbasin diversion. We're hoping to focus on the Moffett-Vermain projection. And then on January 8th, we'll be looking at changing perceptions of transbasin diversions with Eric Kuhn with the Colorado River District and Jim Lockhead with Denver Water. And we'll bring that final event to you also by a webinar, but it will be a live-streamed panel discussion between the two of them. So if you enjoyed today, hopefully you'll join us for more. And we did just get one last question. Do we get CLE credits? We did not apply for CLE credits for this webinar. I apologize for that. But you will be able to watch it as many times as you want in a recorded version. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And we will go ahead and sign off.
Thank you.
Thanks, Becky.